The Arrowverse just had its biggest crossover yet with Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is also the 6th crossover yet, not counting all the mini crossovers, which for the sake of this video, those mini crossovers like the World's Finest and duets between the Flash and Supergirl will not be counted because they're not crossover events. They're different mini crossovers. That could be its own video, but now I'll be ranking all 6 of the main crossovers: Flash vs. Arrow, Heroes Join Forces, Invasion, Crisis on Earth X, Elseworlds, and Crisis on Infinite Earths from worst to best, along with a short review for each crossover. Now, obviously, this is my opinion, so you probably will have a different opinion than mine, and I'm guessing that you definitely will, so let me know your opinion in the comments down below of the ranking of all 6 crossovers. With that in mind, let's begin with the worst crossover ever, which would be the only one I really dislike.
Makes them all heroes.
My hate will follow you for all eternity.
Now, Kendra!
The second crossover, Heroes Join Forces, is a crossover between the Flash Season 2 and Arrow Season 4, which also sets up Legends of Tomorrow Season 1, and as a whole, like I said a minute ago, it's the only crossover I dislike because of actually a couple different things. Before I get into what are the negatives, what do I like about this crossover? Well, it is fun, not maybe as fun as certain other crossovers, but it is fun, obviously, watching Green Arrow and the Flash team up, and the storyline with Barry traveling to the past and reliving the entirety of the events of the crossover, that is a fun storyline. However, I think the negatives very much outweigh the positives, making this a bad crossover, or at least the worst one we've gotten. But what is bad about this crossover, I think definitely involves, first of all, the setup for Legends of Tomorrow, as this crossover was not really a crossover. It was more of just setup for that TV show with Hawkman and Hawkgirl being introduced and Vandal Savage acting as the main villain. All 3 of those characters are absolutely god-awful. The Hawks are are a terrible interpretation of those characters, and Hawkgirl specifically is genuinely annoying. Vandal Savage is also I think a complete waste of the villain Vandal Savage, and not a good interpretation. Those things I think really bring down the crossover, as they really focus on them, and it's just not enjoyable and it's just not fun. However, I think by far the worst thing about this crossover is Felicity Smoke, as she has maybe her worst moment in the entirety of the Arrowverse ever, where her reaction to Oliver not telling her about William, who he learned about an hour ago, was absolutely terrible. It was such an unwatchable moment, and it was in that moment, I think, that I started to genuinely hate Felicity at that point, because that moment she was so unlikable. And the show, I think, wanted you to take her side here, and that Oliver was in the wrong. It was in that moment where I started to dislike Felicity, and it's really annoying when they do that in these crossovers. 3 out of 6 of the crossovers, they insert this drama between Oliver and Felicity, which is completely unnecessary, and it's only in the ones where they're not together or Felicity doesn't appear where they don't do this, and I think that's really evident towards like what is wrong with the Arrowverse at times. But that is the worst crossover ever. Every single crossover after this I like. In fact, I love most of them, but obviously there is going to be a ranking, and I like some more than others.
Tell me you're not actually having this conversation.
You missed. No.
The first ever crossover, Flash vs. Arrow, was a very good start to this annual tradition, as it was a pretty good crossover. It does have some issues, like the fact that there isn't really any narrative through line. It's not a storyline really, it's just really the Arrow guest starring on the Flash, and they fight, and then also the Flash guest starring on Arrow. That's really the entirety of this crossover. It's, again, not really a crossover event, but it's still really fun. The first part in particular, which is what the crossover is named after, Flash vs. Arrow, is a great episode with the storyline of Barry succumbing to Rainbow Raider's powers, and the acting there from Grant Gustin, and him getting angry at Oliver, and then their fight that ensues is really well done, and it's a lot of fun. And that first episode, I think, is up there as one of the better crossover episodes ever. However, the reason this crossover is lower on the list, like I said, it doesn't have a narrative through line, but also the second part is not really as strong, as while the first part definitely kind of feels like a crossover, the second part just doesn't whatsoever. The second part is more just an episode of Arrow with guest stars from Barry, Caitlin, and Cisco, which the first part is also kind of, but it's definitely not as significant as in this episode. There's not only the fact that it mainly focuses on the Arrow characters, and it's, again, just those Flash characters guest starring, but also there's even flashbacks, something that no other crossover had after this, because they focus more on the crossover itself. This, with the flashbacks, it's really just an episode of Arrow, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for the crossovers itself, because this doesn't have a narrative through line, because the second episode doesn't really feel like a crossover, and because it's not really as good as the first episode, which is genuinely great, this is still one of, not I wouldn't say the worst crossovers ever, but I think it is going to be very low on the list because of all of those reasons, but again, I do like it.
You're gonna show these people that this Earth belongs to us.
We will not surrender. We will not back down. We will keep fighting. So get the hell off our Earth while you still can.
Crisis on Earth X was a crossover between Arrow Season 6, The Flash Season 4, Supergirl Season 3, and Legends of Tomorrow Season 3. And I'm guessing this is going to be a little bit controversial, the fact that Crisis on Earth X is at number 4, because it's probably the most popular crossover, right behind the latest one. In fact, I did a poll, and Crisis on Earth X got second place. However, I don't think I like it as much. I mean, obviously I like it. It's higher than Flash vs. Arrow, which is a crossover I do like, because of the narrative through line, because the villains are actually pretty good. Overgirl, Dark Arrow, and Reverse Flash, while not amazing or anything, are certainly pretty good villains, as they do have distinct personalities, and they are a very interesting concept, being these Earth X counterparts of our heroes. At least that's true for Oliver and Kara, but I do think that this crossover has certain problems that it prevents it from being higher on the list. Like Heroes Join Forces, those problems really stem from Felicity, but also this time around Iris, as they get so much screen time, which is genuinely annoying, and Felicity especially with her drama with Oliver, as she doesn't want to marry him, but in the end they hijack Barry and Iris' wedding. It's really things like that drag down crossovers for me personally, and I hate the fact that they keep on putting them in the crossovers. So those things I think really drag down this crossover, specifically making it not as good as people really say it is, and not really higher on the list. However, it's still higher than Flash vs. Arrow and Heroes Join Forces, because it is still a lot of fun. Seeing all these heroes team up with each other, obviously it's a lot of fun, and I think it's a lot more enjoyable than those last two crossovers, at least for the most part, but also it has a level of emotion to it, as the death of Martin Stein is handled very, very well. So while I don't think this crossover is necessarily as good as people say it is, I do enjoy it. I do have problems with it, but I do still enjoy it, and it is basically right here in the middle of the list.
He's rewriting reality again.
Enough! You will not do to this Earth what you did to mine.
I offered you godhood.
Show them what a real god can do.
Elseworlds.
Elseworlds is a crossover between Arrow Season 7, The Flash Season 5, and Supergirl Season 4, and it is, I think, one of the best crossovers of the Arrowverse. Last year, when it came out, I said it's the best crossover ever, but looking back now, I don't think it's necessarily as good as the other two I haven't gone over, which one of them is, it did come out after, but even one that came out earlier, but I still think Elseworlds is a lot of fun, and it is very, very good. I think the best thing about this crossover by far is the body swap between Oliver and Barry, as Barry now has Oliver's abilities and kind of his personality, at least in the first part, and now Oliver has Barry's abilities and powers and his personality as well, and it's so much fun. They do it so well. The actors play off each other so well as well, and even with Supergirl, the Trinity, they just the back and forth between each other, especially in part 1 and also in part 2, is so much fun. Not to mention that, again, especially part 1, I keep on mentioning part 1 as the best thing about this crossover, because it really is. Part 1 of Elseworlds is absolutely amazing, but I think that the Justice League teaming up with the Flash, Green Arrow, Supergirl, and Superman all fighting a very classic Justice League villain of Amazo is one of the coolest moments ever in a crossover, as it really feels like the Justice League, maybe even more than in Crisis on Infinite Earths when the Justice League basically founded, and things like that are why I really like Elseworlds. It is lower, it is only at number 3 because it does have some issues, like in part 3 specifically, there's a lot of stupid moments. like Barry and Kara running or flying around the Earth at Mach 7, which for some reason would slow down time, and they do this for no reason, because if they slow down time, then no other character can do anything, and on top of this, for some reason, this would kill them. Running at Mach 7 kills the Flash when he's ran way faster than that in the past, but yeah, that moment is stupid. There's also Elicity drama in Part 2 that's really unenjoyable, but I do think for the most part, this crossover really holds up, as the Justice League is really fun to watch in Part 1, the Trinity is also really fun to watch in Part 1 and 2, and also kind of 3, and I think that the Crisis set up elements of this crossover, which is something that I really think enhanced the next season of the Arrowverse with the episodes leading up to the Crisis, is really great, and the Monitor is also, it just has such a great introduction in this crossover, but again, it is mainly the body swap concept that holds up this crossover over the likes of Crisis on Earth X, Flash vs. Arrow, and Heroes Join Forces. Invasion is a crossover between The Flash Season 3, Arrow Season 5, and Legends of Tomorrow Season 2, and it's nowhere near the most popular crossover out there. In fact, it's the second least popular based off the poll I did with, which has 10,000 votes, and it didn't include Heroes Join Forces because I could only do 5 options, but I doubt anybody would vote for that, and I think that would be last place, but other than that, Invasion is last place, which honestly, I don't get that. I think Invasion is one of the best crossovers ever, and like you could tell based off this video, I think it is the second best crossover. It's just so much fun. The thing about Invasion is that while it's not as ambitious as certain other crossovers, especially Crisis on Earth X, Elseworlds, and of course Crisis on Infinite Earths, it does have something over those crossovers, or at least the likes of Elseworlds, Crisis on Earth X, and especially Heroes Join Forces, and that's that it just doesn't have very many problems. Felicity appears, but she doesn't have any drama with Oliver, she doesn't have any annoying moments, and she's a genuinely enjoyable and watchable character in this crossover. She doesn't take away anything from the crossover, and the crossover just doesn't have very many problems. On top of that, the first part is a lot of fun, the second part is very good, and it's even slightly emotional, with Oliver and certain other characters from Arrow and Legends of Tomorrow being stuck in this dream world, and the moment Oliver leaves, it definitely has a level of emotion to it, and part 3 is also a lot of fun, and I think that the team-up shot with the heroes running at the Dominators is, to this day, even though there were 3 crossovers after this one, 2 of which definitely did a couple team-up shots, it's still the best team-up shot in any Arrowverse crossover, as it's just so perfect. All of those reasons, I think the fact that this crossover is so much fun, and it's so enjoyable, and also just doesn't have any problems whatsoever, nothing that I roll my eyes at, nothing that I think that it really drags down the crossover. I think for those reasons, Invasion, I think, is at least slightly better than the likes of Elseworlds and Crisis on Earth X, but also a lot better than Heroes Join Forces, and maybe not a lot better, but definitely I think better than Flash vs. Arrow. However, there is one crossover that is still better, and that's obviously...
And we're next.
Every second another Earth dies.
This threat brings the annihilation of all life.
Battle not with monsters.
Crisis on Infinite Earths is a crossover between Supergirl Season 5, Batwoman Season 1, The Flash Season 6, Arrow Season 8, and Legends of Tomorrow Season 5, but it's also technically a crossover also with Black Lightning Season 3, and a whole slew of other TV shows and movies from across the DC multiverse. Now, Crisis on Infinite Earths has been a little bit more controversial than I think it should have ended up being. People didn't really like certain elements of it. Part 2 has a fairly low rating on IMDb especially, but also things like Kate Kane's role in the crossover, things like the fact that Reverse Flash didn't appear, and certain things that they just didn't end up getting to, that left people very disappointed. And yeah, I understand certain things were disappointing. I think the fact that Black Canary from Earth 2 didn't appear was so stupid. However, while this crossover does have problems, unlike the likes of Invasion, I do think that those problems are largely excusable because of how great this crossover really is. This crossover had an impact on the Arrowverse that no other crossover ever had, as the lead up to the crossover made certain seasons, like Arrow Season 8 and The Flash Season 6, so much better than it probably would have ended up being, as those seasons focused on the crisis about to come and that fact that Oliver and Barry were supposed to die in the crossover, and the lead up to that alone really made the crisis already one of the best crossovers ever. And aside from the lead up, there's also the impact of the crossover, where it ends with Earth Prime being created in the new multiverse, which I think is so exciting. Honestly, I'm really interested in almost every Arrowverse show at this point, because I just want to see how the world is different and certain changes and retcons that they can make. So right off the bat, the changes or the consequences, the aftermath, and also the lead up to the crossover already made the Arrowverse so much better, and I think it's things like that really should be in most crossovers. I think they could be the center of every Arrowverse season, and they can elevate those seasons past certain other ones, and I think that alone makes it probably the best crossover ever. But it does help that the crossover itself is a lot of fun, pretty emotional, and I think very, very well done. Crisis on Infinite Earths, I think, had the best storyline out of any crossover, and that storyline was also very, very, very well done. All the cameos, all the movies and TV shows they added to the Arrowverse's multiverse through this crossover, it's really exciting. Some of which, not all of which, most of which weren't really, but some of which, especially Ezra Miller's cameo in Part 4, were so shocking that it really elevates that episode significantly. This crossover is also a lot of fun, obviously. It has got a lot of intense moments because of the lasting consequences of it all, because really nobody is safe. There are a lot of characters that could potentially die. In fact, everybody dies except for like 10 people in the end, and now it's just their Earth Prime counterparts that are alive. But things like that really elevate the crossover, and like I said, it's also very emotional with the death of Oliver Queen in Part 1, which was originally just shock value, which really shocked me, but also on second watch, it's really emotional, to the death of Oliver Queen in Part 4, which is not really shocking. However, it's incredibly emotional and probably the saddest death in the Arrowverse ever, because Oliver Queen is the best character in the Arrowverse ever. So even the death of the 90s Flash in Part 3, or even the death of the multiverse in Part 3, which wasn't emotional obviously because nobody really died. I mean, they died, but nobody reacted to their death. Like, nobody was emotional about a certain character's death, but still, it was incredibly shocking, and definitely the Infinity War snap moment of the crossover. On top of that, the fact that the Justice League actually form in the end, like, they don't really get the name Justice League, and certain members like White Canary, Batwoman, and Black Lightning, and even Supergirl are not typically founding members of the Justice League. It's still really cool, and it's just genuinely fun. On top of all of those things, the Anti-Monitor, while not being as good as I really would have hoped, he definitely was a very good villain, and probably the best crossover villain ever. With all those things in mind, I think that the Crisis on Infinite Earths specifically, is the best crossover ever, and I don't really think it's close. I think Crisis on Infinite Earths is significantly better than any other crossover the Arrowverse has given us, and the fact that it's even, like people are saying that it wasn't good, or that it was disappointing, or that other crossovers are better, I really think it shows how spoiled we were. The fact that the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover is considered disappointing, when it is as big as it is, and it did all the crazy things it did, and I think it did it so well, and I think as a whole, Crisis on Infinite Earths is the best crossover. So anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know your ranking of all 6 crossovers in the comments down below. And if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.